New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring a Chinese book of spiritual alchemy called The Secret of the Golden Flower. My guest is Ronnie Pontiac, who worked as Manly P. Hall's research assistant, screener, and designated substitute lecturer for 7 years. He has produced award-winning documentaries and has written articles for several esoteric magazines. He is author of American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. He lives in Los Angeles, and he is co-author with Tamra Lucid of The Magic of the Orphic Hymns, a new translation for the modern mystic. And now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Ronnie. It's a pleasure to be with you once again. This is our 6th interview, and I hope we'll have at least 6 more, if not beyond that.
I would love that. And as always, I'm honored to be here with you.
Well, we'll be talking about The Secret of the Golden Flower, and we had a preliminary conversation about this in which you shared with me that this book of Chinese Taoist spiritual alchemy was instrumental in transforming your life. So I think this would be a good time to talk a little bit about your life story.
Okay. In order to understand it, I guess I should begin by defining one of the most important aspects of this practice, which is the idea of the lower and higher soul. And in truth, there is no difference. There is only the one soul. Each of us has our spirit. And yet it helps us to think of this as a lower soul and a higher soul. So the lower soul is the part of us that is embroiled in keeping this universe of our body going. And so when you think of all the millions of parts that are all working here in harmony to sustain us through time, and then you add to that what we have to learn about managing our emotions, communicating, how we use our bodies, our ambitions in the world, our relationships, our missions, the various risks that we have to moderate and manage to sustain ourselves. It's quite an endeavor. And in this belief system, the idea is that the lower soul becomes so enmeshed in this highly detailed process that it forgets itself. And in doing so, it becomes claustrophobic and rather negative. And we'll discuss that in greater detail after I give my example of the lower soul exemplified by yours truly. And the higher soul is the part of the soul that remains conscious of what we really are, which is outside time, the shining consciousness that exists outside time, and that brings this harmony to the body. I like to quote Quimby, who was the father of mind cure and of the New Thought movement, and of the whole positive thinking movement to a degree, and was a great influence on Mary Baker Eddy in Christian Science, who had this wonderful little saying that is not at all a bad mantra, which is that the health is how the body experiences the eternity of the soul. And so the idea is that the eternity of our true consciousness, the harmony of it, brings to the body, which is all these separate elements that eventually return to what we might call the sand and loses all its coherence. it brings it the ability to be sustained through time with a sense of identity and health, cohesiveness. So what happens to most human beings is that as we become embroiled in the activities of the body and of our lives, the lower soul, as it turns claustrophobic, it has a very negative feeling about life. It hates life, and it longs for death. And we see this around us in the world today, where we have so many games and movies and so many books and television shows and belief systems that are obsessed with death, or where we play at killing or being killed. And the reason that the lower soul becomes obsessed in this way is because it longs to be free, to feel itself liberated from this claustrophobic responsibility of the body in this world that we live in. And again, we'll go into greater detail about the psychology of that. But to give you some background on myself, and I think I exemplified it in my later teen years, I was somebody that was raised by war survivors. I was an only child, grew up in a gang area, an absolute loner, got beat up a lot, and I had no sense of social contract at all. I became devoted to petty crime, the power of the lie, to cynicism, and I began to study Crowley and Austin Osman Spare, Evola, Hitler, Anton LaVey. I found them all disappointing. I dismissed them as romantics and idealists. I wanted to be a sort of cultural angel of death. I wound up fronting a nihilist band with a following of racists. And our guest list used to include anyone wearing the colors of the Satan's slaves or devil's henchmen. These were biker gangs in my area, and they were security for my band. In fact, there would be people standing on either side of our stage with their arms folded to protect us. And I committed acts of violence and intimidation. I used knives. I even used a car as a weapon on occasion. I planned to die young, and I was devoted to disillusioning optimists. And I laughed at people who believed in any kind of spirituality, or people that wanted to have a good job and a marriage and raise children. I thought that life itself was a farce, and that humanity was the very worst thing in the world. And if anything, nature would be much better off once we were gone. And it seemed to me that we were well on the path to being to suiciding ourselves as a race. And I thought that anything I could do to encourage that sentiment would be a good thing. So I was saved by falling in love. I was approached at a notorious club by a girl who was warned not to talk to me because I had a well-deserved reputation for evil and for violence. But she saw me standing there dressed all in black, smoking a black cigarette, and she was in a desperate situation and in great danger and had no one to turn to. And something about me called to her, and I could tell that she wasn't somebody that was a regular there, that didn't really belong in this scene at all, and had wandered in and was obviously in a very bad situation. So I did protect her. And this called out a chivalry in me that I didn't know I had. And I fell in love with her, and she fell in love with me. We wound up living together within 2 weeks, and this was a major change in my life and set me on the path to the higher soul. And she taught me about honesty and all sorts of wonderful mysteries of life, including flossing, that I had no knowledge of. And suddenly it made a difference to me. I wanted to somehow contribute to the good, although she and I, in many ways, were quite cynical. And the other thing that saved me was Manly Palmer Hall. When especially his teaching, first of all, running into his books and reading them really changed my whole point of view about the possibilities of life. But then becoming his assistant and working with him on a daily basis, and his he opened a whole universe of understanding to me about spirituality that very definitely set me on the path to the higher soul. And among the things that he was very interested in was this secret of the golden flower. And at the time that I knew him, most people think of Manly Hall as someone who was deeply into the occult. In his early years, under the influence of theosophy, he wrote a great deal about initiates and invisible masters. And even at the end of his life, he would sometimes romanticize about those subjects. But when I knew him in the last roughly 10 years of his life, I knew him for 7 years, he was deeply into Eastern religion. He was deeply into Taoism. He was deeply into Shingon Buddhism, and indeed was one of the first people to write about Shingon Buddhism, which is a Japanese form of Buddhism, in English. And his practices, his lifestyle had many overtones of these practices. And so I was deeply impressed by them and read deeply in them and got to discuss some of these materials with him. So that's my story. If I could find the path, anybody can. I was certainly one of the worst people that you could become, and devoted to that. And I think I exemplified the way that the lower soul hates life and loves death and is cynical about everything and everyone and amasses reasons to be cynical. So let's talk for a bit now about well, first, what I'd like to talk about is the history of these ideas, just briefly, and then we'll get into the psychology of the lower soul and the higher soul, and then we'll get into the practice itself, if that's okay with you.
You've got everything outlined already. Okay, let's start with the history, and I should mention I did a little brushing up myself, and I gather that Richard Wilhelm, who did the first translation and influenced Carl Jung so much. Actually, he was a Christian minister, as I recall, and he believed that this very well may have been a Christian text originally, because Christianity was introduced into China as early as around 650 A.D., and the Secret of the Golden Flower as a book wasn't even written down for 1,000 years after that.
That is correct. And it was Nestorian Christianity that he thought had influenced it. But as we'll see shortly, there's some serious problems with Wilhelm's scholarship and as a result with Jung's interpretation of these materials. But let's begin with what we do know about it. In the Chinese tradition, an origin is claimed around the 12th century, although it is said that some of the practice go all the way back to the 3rd century. And we can be certain of only this, that the written text as we have it was created by 2 groups of students, one in 1688 and the other in 1692. That's when the material as we have it was written down. But much like the Tibetan so-called Book of the Dead, there were many different variations of this teaching and many different derivations for it. So not too long ago, for example, a professor at Kyoto University discovered a very old text of it that stated that it was produced by spirit channeling. And so it was directly a communication from spirit, which is very interesting. It was very much influenced by various Taoist schools of alchemy, as you've mentioned, but also very much influenced by Buddhism in China, and was often found itself as sort of a nexus of Buddhism and Taoism. And in the terminology and ideas that we find in the practice, we do find a mix of Taoist alchemy and of Buddhist meditative techniques. So it's a wonderful hybrid. And then to spend a moment on Wilhelm and on Jung, because they were such a huge influence on how the West perceived these materials. And even now, people recommend the Wilhelm text, which is very problematic. So Wilhelm's Chinese was not the best. And he did depend heavily on Chinese advisors And Cleary, who is probably the top scholar on this in the modern age, he believes that these were probably cultists who were very influenced by certain yogic practices. So I'll give you some examples of mistranslations and such. So there's a section in the practice that's called The Secret of Freedom. Well, this was translated by Wilhelm as a magic spell for the far journey. Now you can see there's this mystifying kind of magical quality that he brings to it. I mean, in a way, I mean, it's really not the same, but you can kind of see how secret could be magic spell and freedom could be the far journey. But if you didn't know what was underlying it, you would completely miss the point. Another mistranslation that is much more problematic is that at one point there's a discussion of concentration on the center. And in the Taoist text, it's made very clear that there is no such center. In other words, there isn't one place in the body. It means to concentrate in the balance between the two extremes of anything. But this was interpreted by Wilhelm as to concentrate on the point between the two eyes, which is a common sort of third eye concentration practice from yoga. But in the Taoist text, that is considered very dangerous and is actually said to be a distraction from the real practice, and is also said to potentially shorten the life of somebody who spends too much time doing this kind of concentration. So that's a dramatic example of how off some of this material was. And so Jung, of course, experienced this text through the prism of Wilhelm. And Wilhelm even had the idea of the anima and the animus in his translation. He associated the anima with the lower soul and the animus with the higher soul. And this encouraged Jung in doing the same and in ascribing a kind of inferiority to the lower soul that is not in the Taoist text. And in fact, as we'll see as we go on, you could make an argument, you would be wrong, but you could make a plausible argument that if you were going to use gender in understanding the lower and higher soul, you would probably give female to the higher soul, because it is usually compared to as the mother and the lower soul is the child, although sometimes the higher soul is the husband and the lower soul is the wife. But in all these cases, it's made very clear that actual gender is not what is intended here. This isn't a comment on the sexes. It's merely a convenient metaphor. And so I will mention here as well that much of this material, as I'm discussing it with you, these are metaphors. We are not to fixate on these definitions. We're not to fixate on the idea of the soul or on lower or higher or any of this stuff. These are all just ways of getting a sense of what we're trying to discover here, which is something that is beyond words. Now, this was problematic for Jung in many ways because he, for example, had some very bizarre ideas about what he called the Chinese psyche. And they were based on The Secret of the Golden Flower being inaccurately translated. And so he advised Westerners that they should not practice this or other sorts of related Eastern practices because they were unsuited for Westerners. But the reasons that he gave for that were completely wrong, based on mistranslations. And so it really warped Western understanding of The Secret of the Golden Flower. And in some senses, it warped Jung's own teachings because he became fixated, for example, on images that were self-originating of self and of others as being very key. And he saw his form of psychology as being the Western answer to the practice of the Golden Flower. But as a result, he never achieved the higher state that the practice is intended to achieve. And so he didn't really understand what was being gotten at here. And he suffered what is called distraction in the Taoist text, which is getting lost in all these myriad details and putting them into some kind of order. And that's not how we experience what is really called the shining mind or the sky-like mind. So now let's return to some of these interesting definitions, because this will really help us to understand what we're trying to achieve here and what we are given in our human experience to work with. So the secret of the golden flower, it can be said to relate in a sense to the process of death, and is a preparation in a sense for being able to die well. In the Tibetan Jung scripture, the precious garland, there's a moment described, and the sentence is, when consciousness remains as an orphan with no support. And that is the moment of death. So we're so used to, we have our body, we have our mind, we have our memories, we have the people and the places that surround us, and suddenly here is this, if you wouldn't mind, this bare ass consciousness that hasn't got anything to relate to and has no experience of this except possibly in dreams. But even there, we're strongly related to the various objects of the dreams. And so how do we deal with this? How do we get ready to have that kind of consciousness, which after all is our true self? And this is very similar, by the way, to the unobstructed universe teachings of Stuart and Betty White. And in fact, in a book I've written about them, I do compare how closely these teachings ally with theirs, which is very interesting, especially since they both may have had origins from spiritual channeling. So the lower soul, let's consider that first, where most of humanity lives, and which our universe, our world right now, at least on the planet Earth, is very strongly demonstrating. So the lower soul hates life. It longs for death. It tends to be morbid and destructive, fearful and pessimistic. It sees life out there as something that's powerful and dangerous and uncaring, enduring, while mortal lives are vulnerable and frail. At any moment, we could just be effaced. And having forgotten itself because of its immersion in keeping the physical body going, it's longing for liberation from all the fears associated with keeping the body going. And so in the practice, they describe what most of us do with our lives as leaking. We leak light. The lower soul leaks light. So we intellectualize spirituality. We intellectualize culture. We amass facts like I did to support our cynicism. We find prognostications and justifications of pessimism in history and in current events. And we have a feeling that doom is certain, as I did. We may be obsessed on things like pop culture or hobbies or ambitions or accumulating collections or sexuality, conquests, missions in life, crusades. And so many of us pick something and we decide, well, this race of people is ruining everything, or that gender is ruining everything, and I've got all the proof. And we turn our corrosive, cynical humor on anyone who dares to be positive or sentimental. And we consider ourselves wise because we're facing reality as it is. This is all typical of the lower soul. Often suffering the affliction of false certainty. We fear change. We fear new technology. All new technology is going to lead to disaster. As we discussed in another of our talks, Socrates had a great deal of anxiety about the written word because he thought that it was really denigrating teaching. And Plato captures that. And so, especially among older generations, there's also this tendency to conflate the limited horizon of a personal body with the entirety of humanity. Now, I jumped right to that as a teenager. I didn't have to get older. I thought, no, we're all doomed immediately. It's coming up any minute. And so one of the impacts of this is that the body loses harmony and it loses vitality, not just because of the stress and the exhaustion of believing these things and what it does to our our endocrine system and to our nervous system, but also because the disconnection from the higher soul means that we're unable to recharge. And this creates exhaustion and sickness. And so there's a saying in the text that's quite wonderful that describes this, which is, in a single day, one breathes countless times, so has countless random thoughts. When the luminosity of spirit has leaked out completely, one is like a withered tree or dead ashes. And so this is the predicament of the lower soul. We ridicule deeply felt love. It's sentimental, it's stupid, it's doomed to die in the agony of separation and loss. Men are taught to prefer the company of men and to regard women as inferior and problematic. And women say that men are primitive and would prefer the company of other women. And our families often dwell together in neglect and even hatred. It's considered manly for men not to feel tender emotions of loving, being a loving husband or father. In a way, it's easier, I've always thought, to face death that way, because you get away from people who you don't like, who disappointed you, and from the job you hate, and from the world that you hate. And it is kind of difficult when you really deeply love and you feel the sense of cherishing life and cherishing people and pets and places. There is an agony that those who are anesthetized by cynicism can sometimes escape. And Kukai, who was the founder of Shingon Buddhism, had a beautiful saying about this. He said, although it is said that it is impossible to be disturbed by anything when reaching enlightenment, I could not help but cry upon bidding farewell to a loved one. So even someone as deeply enlightened with great attainment as Kukai is telling us, you don't escape that feeling. If you deeply love and you lose that person, even though you know that they continue, that they're still with you, the lack of their physical presence will make even a Buddha cry. Now, let's talk about the higher soul. This is quite different. The higher soul is like sunrise. If you think of being in the dark, away from the lights of civilization, like maybe you're camping and you're under the dark of the moon, or there are clouds, so there's just no light. We don't see color. We don't see the horizon. We can only see a few feet in front of us. But when the sun rises, all colors blaze into life. The distant horizons are visible again. The great expansion and the sense of wonder is what it's like to reconnect with the higher soul. Suddenly there is all this light around us and color, and we cherish life and we can see far. So the higher soul remains aware of its existence outside time, but it's forgotten by the day-to-day consciousness of the lower soul. The higher soul loves life. It cherishes the humble details and beauties of the adventures of life. It's comfortable with the inscrutable mystery of life without having to explain it. When we awaken to the higher soul, we realize that so-called reality in the material world that we were so afraid of because it was so powerful and so has such a persistence is really impermanent. While consciousness, at its shining depths and its origin, is outside time and endless. So now we find the dance of life and we collaborate instead of reacting against it. We find faith in fate and in other human beings because we understand that the higher soul indwells all. Or as you might say, the Buddha is within everyone and everything. As we practice, we build what is called a body of light, the body that we inhabit after death. We become accustomed to being this unobstructed consciousness. We're comfortable with it. And in the practice, this is called our body beyond the body. So we begin with a development best described, I think, by Cleary's translation of the Taoist sage Liu Yiming, which is, when yin and yang combine into one, the celestial order is clearly revealed. The innate knowledge and capacity which had been about to fade away in people is now round and bright, clean and bare. A bead of golden elixir hangs in the center of vast space, lighting up the universe to view, unobstructed in all directions. So the harmony of remembering the higher soul increases the harmony and health of our bodies, helps us to avoid other forms of unnecessary suffering. So even aging is considered to be something that the lower soul becomes involved in. And the unobstructed universe teachings, they call it a Neanderthal superstition. But the idea is that we usually wind up pursuing objects and we age in conformity with others around us. So we have these, at this age, we're supposed to be like this, and we're supposed to look like this, and we all believe it. And so we do this kind of mass hypnosis of experiencing time as various difficulties with the aging process. And I'm sure we all know people who seem to be outside of the process in some sense. And so you will see people who are much older than others, but who seem much younger. And I know when I met Manly Hall, he certainly was an older looking man, and his physical senses were somewhat challenged, and he didn't walk very quickly, although he never did. And yet he was so brilliant. His memory, his mind was unaffected. And I had been, as a child, around people who were in their 80s and who were, they expected to have real problems with memory and to not have any of the brilliance that they had in their youth, and to become dull in a sense and sort of retiring away from life. So it was a revelation for me to be around this man who on any given day would be writing an article, working on a book, working on the business of the place, preparing for a lecture, all these things in one day, and who could send me off into this library of tens of thousands of volumes and would tell me what shelf a book was on and what it looked like and just exactly where to get it. He was crystal clear. And that made me realize that one did not have to age in conformity with what society expects. And since then, I've met many people like that, including actually when I was working at PRS, I met this extraordinary man who showed up at my lectures. His name was Dr. Apt. And he had been a chiropractor for many years, but was retired. And he was well into his 90s. He was blind, but he got around using public transportation. And he liked my lectures enough that he took interest in Tamra, the girl that I saved who became my wife, and in myself. And he came over to our apartment one day, and he wanted to teach us some simple lessons. And the one that was most memorable was he advised us to take on some kind of yogic practice in our youth and keep it going so that we didn't have to suffer the kind of ailments that people who ignore their bodies do. And then he hopped into a full headstand in front of us in his 90s. We were stunned, needless to say. So I've been fortunate to see examples of these kinds of people. And if you keep your eyes open, you can find them all over the place. And in the golden flower practice, this is considered to be part of the benefit of the practice. Because as this harmonious higher soul that is unobstructed and that loves life is again in union with the lower soul, we now have an infusion of energy. We have a healing process that occurs. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail when we talk about the practice.
Did you actually engage in the formal practice of the secret of the golden flower?
Yes. Yes, I still practice it. It's a constant practice. Like Zen, it's something that there's a beginner stage in this particular practice. They call it the 100 days, which is more of a metaphor, and it can be taken literally, but not necessarily. And the practice during the 100 days, which we'll discuss, is different. It's an establishing practice, and they warn us to not to become addicted to that practice. If we do so, then we can't achieve the higher levels. And I was very fortunate to be able to talk to Manly Hall about these practices, and he once actually was responding to Tamra, who had some questions for him about meditation, and he said that he had reached the stage in his life where he was practicing what's called kinhin, which is a Zen walking meditation. And he explained that what that meant was that he no longer needed to sit in meditation to gain the state, that he could sustain meditation throughout his activities. So he could be writing or lecturing or having a nice dinner or eating junk food, for that matter, or meeting with someone, and he would be in this meditative state, or to use the terminology of the golden flower, he was in the awareness of the higher soul at all times. And I wonder if this is why the many synchronicities that we witnessed around him occurred. We used to think, well, it's because he's so deeply in the Tao. Other people thought it was because he was a secret initiate of the invisible orders. Other people thought it was because he was deeply in touch with spirit, and spirit was causing these things to happen around him. All these definitions are really metaphors for something that escapes words, but we saw him so many times have these synchronicities with ourselves and with other people. In fact, my arrival in his life was a synchronicity, where he needed somebody who happened to have my skills that I didn't even know I had. But he felt I had them, and he was right. It turned out that I did. And there were many dramatic examples. I'll give you a small one. When Tamra and I were studying Apollonius of Tyana, and we read that, Philostratus is highly questionable, a little bit of a dramatist. And we read that there had been a riot going on, and Apollonius stood by the riot just in a peaceful, dignified way, and that his presence was so powerful that it silenced the riot. And we read that, and I had just been studying the Iliad with this wonderful scholar, Kenneth Atchity, a great Homeric scholar, and I thought that this was a satire on the scene where Achilles, after the death of Patroclus, comes out and he sees the Trojans and the Greeks fighting over the body. He's not even wearing clothes. He's naked, and he screamed in rage. And everyone saw him, like one by one, all the warriors turned and saw him, and the battle stopped because the Trojans were in terror of him, and even the Greeks were so awed by his wrath. So we thought, well, this must be Philostratus just riffing off of Homer. And we wanted to talk to Manly Hall about it and ask him, is this real? I mean, there's no way, right? You couldn't put one person next to a riot and stop a riot. That's ridiculous. And so that happened to be one of the days when he asked us to come have dinner with him and his wife, Marie. And so we went to a restaurant, and it was a night that was very, very busy, and they were not able to accommodate him. Usually they would just bring him right in past the line. But he said, no, that's fine. I'll wait in line. It's no problem. And Marie went off to park the car, insisting that we stay with him. And there was a man and a woman in front of us, a man and wife. And he was angry about having to stay in line and very irritated when his wife tried to make room for Manly Hall and was being very kind about this elderly gentleman who was standing there with his cane. And for some reason that angered him. And so he started to get red-faced. He grabbed her arm and made her wince. And we watched Manly Hall he moved. It was like Tai Chi master moves. He barely moved his feet, and he wasn't looking. He never looked at the guy during this whole thing, but he just sort of put himself in the way. And she got a sense of what he was doing, and she hid behind him, and that really enraged her husband. And this guy got up on his tiptoes. His face was red, and he starts screaming. He's spitting, at Manly Hall up into his face. And Manly Hall is staring off like he's looking at a garden. He couldn't be more peaceful. And I was ready to fight. I reverted to who I'd been. I turned sideways and was ready to go. And Tamra was horrified because she'd grown up in an abusive, violent situation, and we didn't know what was going to happen. But Manly Hall just stood there as peaceful as you can imagine. And eventually we watched this man become ashamed. And he just sort of slumped and realized what he was doing. And he asked for forgiveness. And he took his wife by the hand and he led her away from the line. So needless to say, we did not ask Manly Hall about could one man stop a riot, because we thought he had just demonstrated what Apollonius did in a way. And those kind of synchronicities were so constant with him. And I think now, in retrospect, that this was because he had achieved a sustained consciousness of the higher soul. And at least at that point in his life, it was so strong that it was creating these harmonious moments around him that were usually associated with teaching, with people learning important things on their paths. So I was very fortunate to have his example and to have some discussions with him about these practices.
Did he also specifically practice the golden flower method?
I don't know. I know that he read the Secret of the Golden Flower, but all he had was the Wilhelm version. And I know that he was deeply steeped in all kinds of different Taoist and Buddhist teaching from Japan and China. And since the practice is a distillation of those practices, I feel like he had it. And he had gotten the same lessons that are so beautifully distilled into this particular practice that became clear when Cleary's translation came out. Now, I do know that Wilhelm's translation was an influence on him, and he was very interested in Chinese alchemy.
I've always been impressed with the illustrations that accompanied I guess it would be the Wilhelm translation. It showed the meditation practice in 4 stages, and I believe there was an illustration for each of the 4, or at least for 3 of the 4 stages. And I found it fascinating that you see the Taoist, looks like a Taoist priest or something, in meditation, and then I guess it's at the 3rd stage, you see like this higher self rising above his head into a timeless stage. But the one that really impressed me is the 4th stage, where the higher self has now expanded into 5, and each of the 5 has another 5, I guess related to the 5 elements in Chinese culture. But the idea now is that, in a sense, the higher self has, one might say, 5 components, and each of those has 5 components, and the meditator is at peace amongst all of them and sees all of them in their uniqueness as well, it seemed to me.
Yeah, it's a wonderful illustration. And like most Taoist symbology, has multiple levels. So I like to look at it as an actual mandala of the golden flower practice, because what you have is here is the higher soul at the center in its full awareness, and it is circulating energy, sharing energy, and drawing energy back from the 5 elements, which represent the aspects of the body, including the 5 senses as the Chinese see them, although there's other versions with more, which include thinking and feeling. And so And then we have the material world, which is also made up of the 5 elements. And so in the perfect harmony of the higher self, the body is in its 5 parts in harmony, made up of the 5 elements. And the world is in harmony, made up of the 5 elements. It's really a beautiful depiction of how, when one brings the awareness of the higher soul into the world, everything turns into this greater harmony. And it's the same thing that is depicted in Buddhist mandalas, and by the saying that that the Buddha world is this world, that when one achieves the consciousness of the Buddha, then we see revealed that this is the paradise world. This is the world, the highest Buddhist heaven, because the highest Buddhist heaven coexists with what we experience as a hell, many of us. And in fact, in this practice, there's some terminology that's called feeding on blood. And feeding on blood is when you are so addicted to the body that you feel that it's the only way that you can survive. And the West misinterpreted, many Western scholars misinterpreted depictions of Buddhist hell as meaning something like permanent hell. And this actually was not the case, because the hell is what happens when we die if we are feeding on the blood. So the panic of it's so tragic, right? Because we're actually achieving liberation. We're returning to the timeless, shining mind, but we're so terrified of losing what we're familiar with that it turns into a hell experience for us. And our own projections become demons, and our fears materialize before us as if in a dream. So I like to bring up when I'm teaching this or talking about this practice, I like to talk about the Vajrakalaya practice, because it's very related, I think. And this is a form of Buddhism. We know in the ancient world, and even in today's world, especially in the Christian religion, that there is a belief in demons. And we can see even in the Western tradition in magic, for example, the tendency to turn ancient gods into demons. So we had talked last about the hymns of Orpheus and the Greek gods, and there are people who are afraid of the Greek gods because they must be demons, since they're not the one true god. They're demons impersonating ancient gods. And we see among modern writers on magic, for instance, the goddess Bast, the Egyptian cat goddess, who was a protector of justice. You think of cats and the way that they kill vermin and protect the food. And in ancient Egypt, they were considered symbols of justice and of a force that protects the harmony that makes life possible. And we see them reduced in grimoires to demons of pleasure. So Bast is now considered a demon of pleasure rather than being a goddess of justice. And I mean, I must say, a particularly egregious form of cultural appropriation. And so the Vajrakalaya practice reminds us that Buddha, or what would be called in the Golden Flower, the higher soul, dwells within all beings, including these alleged demons. That these demons are not evil forever, and they simply have forgotten themselves and have fallen into the lower soul. So I would say that when I was a teenager, I was a demonic presence in people's lives. I certainly had a demonic effect on people, brought out the worst in people. There was so much violence around my gigs. And I mean, Tamra once it was joking about it, said that I was trying to create another Altamont, and in retrospect, I kind of was. And so what the Vajrakalaya practice does is it begins, the priests make these loud noises, they clash cymbals, and they bang on big drums, and they blow these discordant horns, because the demons love these loud, chaotic sounds, and they come flocking in to see what this chaos is. And then the priests chant the Vajrakalaya chant together. And essentially what they're saying is, okay, now that I've got your attention, you are stuck because I am here to tell you that you have within you the Buddha. You are the higher soul, and you cannot resist being enlightened because that is the truth about who you are. And these demons are then converted into wrathful deities who protect the Dharma, who protect the teaching of Buddha. So instead of creating chaos in the world, that anger is put to work on protecting those who are teaching the true Buddhist teaching, and on trying to help everyone else have this experience of coming to the awareness of what the Golden Flower calls the higher soul. And I love to use that as an example because it's quite similar. And by the way, it's similar to the Orphic teaching that we talked about last time, right? Of the Titans who have part of what we are and who act with great destructiveness and envy and jealousy of the gods. And yet we are also children of Dionysus, grandchildren of Zeus. So we have within us this divinity of starry heaven. And we live our lives trying to purify ourselves so that we can actually attain remembering and not be cursed into these ignorant rebirths where we experience a succession of hellish lifetimes. It's quite similar. And in fact, people have theorized that there may have been Buddhist influence on the Orphic teaching. And Campbell actually thought that it wasn't a direct influence, but that there was a literature that arose from what he called the Great Lament, which was a period of history where there was widespread suffering due to climate change and other factors that were outside of human control that caused a lot of war and disease. And there were these great lamentations and these new religions born that had to do with purification. And so he thought that there was a common origin there. But certainly the similarities are clear.
I'm under the impression, Ronnie, that the Taoists, including those who engaged in the secret of the Golden Flower practice, were also into magic themselves. And they considered themselves magicians, I think maybe in the Persian sense of a mage. And when I look at that image of all of the higher spirits surrounding the meditator, I'm under the impression that in this higher form of magic, one might anticipate, without ever commanding these spirits to do anything, that they are going to be out there in the world creating synchronicities that support the magician, that support the Tao ultimately.
Yes, very definitely, because in the Taoist magical belief, everything has spirits. It's not unlike indigenous American beliefs where a rock, a jewel, a plant has a spirit. And so even within our bodies, it is said that there are indwelling spirits that run the different organs and that bring the harmony of the body when they're all working together. So the very same depiction we were just talking about can be taken that way, as controlling the spirits through this harmony that make up the body and the experience of life, but also being in harmony with all the spirits out there that are making life happen and who are behind all these external manifestations. So the Taoist master, when moving in the Tao, has this ability to receive this kind of invisible help. And it's why, for example, in martial arts in the East, it's said that the highest form of martial arts is to be fighting within the Tao. So we have achieved a level of that higher soul awareness, and we don't hate our enemy. We simply are in that moment. It's similar to Bruce Lee's method, which was no method, where he did not have, as most martial artists have, a series of learned exercises that you then put to work in attacking somebody, and you think about what you need to do to offset what they're doing. He was in the moment, and he had learned so much already that he could trust that. And it was very difficult to defeat him because of the speed at which he could react to anything. And his reactions were natural. You were not fighting Bruce Lee. You were fighting the Tao. You were fighting nature. And so it was said that for the highest level of warriors, it was impossible to defeat them because you were fighting the whole world when you fought them, because they were in such harmony with the world. And you could describe that as all the spirits were helping this master in this battle.
Let me ask you why the text is called The Secret of the Golden Flower. What is the golden flower to represent? Is that the higher self?
That's one way to put it, definitely. Let's talk about the practice for a minute, because I want to make sure to share that, and that will explain it. So the golden flower practice itself, and when you start it, is simple. They say, put your mind on your breath. Put your breath on your mind. There's a Taoist alchemical classic from the 1800s called Spiritual Alchemy for Women, because women were an important part of this teaching. And there's a quote in it that says, in the beginning, what is most essential is self-refinement, which is mind and breath resting on each other. So what does that mean? It means that we don't suppress our thoughts. Those thoughts are considered the breathing of the soul. We just let them flow past. We don't attach to any particular thought, whether it's attractive or repulsive. We just let them flow past. We breathe deeply and slowly. The goal is to not be able to hear the breathing, and to not even be able to feel the intake of the breath through the nostrils, to be that gentle, that slow, and taking these big, deep breaths. And this is called not using the six senses, which are thinking, feeling, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling. And it's a way of giving the senses a rest. And in Taoism, this is considered the highest form of hygiene for the mind and for the body. So what we're doing is we're stilling the restless human mind, which has been conditioned by life experiences. And when we do that, eventually what is revealed is the primal celestial mind, as they call it, which is the golden flower, which is also called the pivot of creation. This is called turning around the light, or controlling the outside from the inside. So we stop leaking. We stop leaking light into the world by being obsessed with reacting to things all the time, whether it's positive or negative. And we give our bodies and our minds a break, and we just breathe. So our mind watches our breathing, and our breathing is peaceful. Obviously, they noticed that when human beings become agitated, we breathe and we become calm. So all it is adapting that insight into human behavior. When you breathe slowly, you help to calm the mind. And there are, by the way, Taoist healing breaths that are loud and noisy, and they have other purposes. But for this particular purpose of the awareness of the golden flower, we want to have this deep, imperceptible breathing and have our minds just wrapped up in that. We draw away from everything. And so in the beginning, they suggest often that this can be done in the morning, or it can be done at night. The kind of a typical meditation twice a day of starting the day and ending the day kind of process. But the goal here is, and they say that it takes 100 days, although again, that's a metaphor, the goal is to work on sustaining this clarity. And as we perform the other tasks of our day, and we are being drawn into that conditioned, what they call the conditioned mind of daily life, we are able to sustain the awareness of the higher soul. And the higher soul is itself the golden flower. It's a secret because it's forgotten. But it was also called the secret of the golden flower, or possibly more correctly, the secret teaching of the golden flower, because there were times when the Taoists taught this only to students who had earned the privilege of learning it. It wasn't available to everyone. But it's also a secret because it's forgotten, because as we all fall into the lower soul, we just don't remember this higher soul or what it brings into our lives. And so that makes it a secret. And in Buddhism, what we're talking about here is called emptiness. It's not a really good translation, in my opinion, although it's widely accepted by English translators. I think sky-like, which is more literal, works better. The mind of emptiness is sky-like the clear blue sky of daylight, pure, unobstructed awareness, containing everything. The Buddhists call this the shining mind. And the other mind, the mind of the lower soul, they call the stirring mind. This is the mortal mind. And it is always being stirred up, but it's also always stirring experiences and reacting, and it has its agendas. So when this shining mind is brought into the kind of Zen walking meditation that Manly Hall was talking about, we achieve a constancy of clarity. And so we can remain peaceful even when we're sick. We can face natural disasters with a sense of serenity and tranquility. We can help people without becoming entangled. We can react appropriately and naturally to whatever comes up in our lives. And one of the things that they say in the teaching, because it's so easy to fall into these words and these metaphors, some of them are so beautiful, and you try to achieve them exactly as they seem to indicate. But they say when you drink cold water, you know what it tastes like. And this is to remind us that this is always changing, that to really have the practice, we have to be in the moment. And even the practice itself can become an obstacle to being in the moment.
I get the impression, particularly looking at the illustrations, which seem to speak to me, that it might be taken as sort of projecting consciousness outside of the body. It could be into a timeless realm, a timeless, spaceless realm, an eternal realm. But it might also be, I think there are many intermediate realms, particularly realms that are of interest to people in the practice of magic, the astral plane and such things, that one could project one's consciousness into those realms. Is that at all part of the practice?
I think so. With the provision, and returning to Shingon Buddhism again, to Kukai, the founder, he had a wonderful passage in one of his commentaries on one of the primal tantras, in which he says, when we dream, we may experience 100,000 years in a moment. We may traverse a huge kingdom, and we may meet all kinds of magical characters. But when we wake up, we realize that it's all gone. And he says the same is true of Shingon. If we dream of the 100,000 Buddhas of the Flower Ornament Sutra, when we wake up, they're still gone. And you see, this is that desire to get back into the present moment. So you can certainly explore all these different realms that are created by the mind, which is the creator. And and you can greatly benefit from them and pursue your various tasks. But there's a danger there, which is becoming addicted to them, becoming addicted to the powers. And there's constant warnings in Taoist tracts, in Buddhist tracts, and in the Golden Flower about, they say, yes, the practice of the Golden Flower will cause magical things to happen in your life, but don't pay too much attention to them, or you will lose the practice. And we can see that people who, for example, especially if you're using these techniques to attain material ends, to prevail in your magical battle, to gain material objects and such, you may gain certain powers that you can bring to bear, but you will lose the whole point of the practice if you become too addicted to those things. So they're supposed to happen naturally. So when it's time for you to have experiences of, let's call it the astral realm or the intermediate realms, you will have them, and you will do these explorations. You have amazing teaching experiences in dreams, for example, that are very valuable. And I have to say that my understanding of the Golden Flower experience was massively helped by a dream that I had where the practice was demonstrated to me. And the weirdest thing of all, I hesitate to even say it, is that it was a cat. It was a cat that I loved dearly, whose name happened to be Flower. And she appeared in one of my dreams, and she taught me how to actually experience what I'd been trying to experience for so long. And what I experienced was very similar, again, to the unobstructed way teachings, which is that our consciousness can be everywhere. And in fact, when we leave the particularization of the body, we return to this unobstructed state where, as it said in that earlier quote, the entire universe is lit up and we see everything. We can contain everything and any particularity, all the dimensions, the entire unity of it. The universe of Buddhas described in the Flower Ornament Sutra. And yet, there's a freedom of that shining mind that is beyond all of these forms. So as beautiful, as ravishingly beautiful as these visions are, they are not really the mystery. And that's what I learned in that dream. In that dream, I learned to efface my body experience and to be in everything that was around me, and then to come back and be in my body. And that's the beauty of it. That's the secret of the Golden Flower, is that your consciousness is infinite. And so when you are liberated from your body, you return to the universe. And that doesn't mean that you disappear into it or that you lose your individuality. It means that as a part of it, you share in the entirety of it. It's very hard to understand unless you've had experiences that give you inklings of it. But that is the intent of the practice, is to bring that flowering of the higher soul that has that infinity within it. And so then, yes, all the of course, if you think about Blavatsky, who brought so many of these ideas about the astral realm and the Akashic records, I mean, she was teaching a garbled version of Mahayana Buddhism. And that's what Shingon Buddhism is. And that's what a good part of the practice of the Golden Flower is Mahayana Buddhism, the greater vehicle. So it's interesting that it sort of went around in a full circle. And a lot of people dismiss some of the ideas as New Age, things like the Akashic records. And they kind of laugh at it as being sentimental or fuzzy thinking. But in fact, underpinning it are some of the deepest insights about human consciousness that have ever been discovered and shared.
Let's talk for a moment about Carl Jung and Richard Wilhelm. I know The Secret of the Golden Flower has had a big impact in the West, and it's largely due to Jung's commentary on Wilhelm's translation, originally in German, then later translated into English by someone else. But as I understand it, Jung regarded Wilhelm as one of the most enlightened people he had ever known. And at the same time, if I remember correctly, he also noted that Wilhelm seemed very rigid with regard to one thing, which was his commitment to Orthodox Christianity, not the Orthodox, Greek Orthodox Christianity, but he was, I think, a Protestant minister. And Jung found it very strange that such an enlightened person would be so stuck in Protestantism as Wilhelm seemed to be. But as I think about it, since the teachings are ultimately so universal, and since Wilhelm was essentially a Christian mystic living in China, speaking Chinese and translating this Chinese document, it seems understandable to me that he would see into it the possibility of a Christian influence.
Yes, absolutely. And first, I want to recommend to you and to anyone interested, especially who's read and enjoyed Wilhelm, which is where we all started, definitely pick up Cleary's translation. And in his notes, he gives in great detail where the errors occurred and how they relate to the original text. It's really fascinating. And he does talk about Jung at length and about ways that this impacted Jung. And so I want to say, you mentioned about its huge influence in the West. And to just illustrate that, for example, when Israel Regardie put out his complete system of Golden Dawn magic, in the middle pillar ritual, he included his version of the secret of the golden flower practice. He was that influenced by it and by Jung's introduction to it. And Cleary points out that when he began to research it, he found that every religion, people from really every religion and every walk of life had embraced it at one time or another. So it is very much a universal practice. It does not require a specific religion or a belief in a specific God. It's more of a meditation exercise that can be applied to anyone's belief system and will enrich it. So, as for Wilhelm, I think that you said it. He's a funny combination of great enlightenment and rigidity. Partially, I think, because of the mistranslations, because he misunderstood. For instance, we've been talking quite a bit about how dangerous it is to become addicted or fixated on certain definitions. And he translated some of that material in the opposite way, saying that it was very important to become fixated on some of these images. And that, I think, prevented him from being able to liberate himself from that rigidity. Nevertheless, even with all his mistakes, he did bring a great deal of the essence of the teaching to Jung and to the West. And enough of it got through there that it became so very influential. And it liberated him to a great degree. And it was a great inspiration to Carl Jung and to many, many others, including Regardie. So I think that it's an accident of mistranslation. It's strange. Again, Cleary thought that the problem had been that Wilhelm was not able to get around the real Taoist masters of the golden flower technique. It was very difficult to find them and to be accepted by them. And that most likely he met people who were okay with working with a Christian minister, a Westerner. I mean, the Taoists of that period would probably have been very leery, the great masters, of bringing that sort of a student into the fold. They were very aware of what they called the degeneration of the practice, because at one time it became very popular in China, and for sociological and political reasons, people were drawn to it. And this created problems in terms of how to control these large groups of people all of a sudden who were studying. And they thought that it actually degraded the teachings to some degree. And there was a fear at different points of the history of this teaching of not just sharing it with foreigners, but even there were schools of the Taoist side of it that were very unhappy with the Buddhist interpolations. And there were Buddhist practitioners who thought that the Taoists were reprehensible magicians who all they wanted to do was achieve long life and be healthy, which was considered very materialistic. And to the Buddhists, missed the whole point. So there was a lot of defensiveness in these schools over the centuries. Even writing the teaching down, as you mentioned, look how long it took. I mean, if the origins of some of these practices are truly 3rd century, it's not written down till 1688 and 1692. And they were loath to put it down in paper so that people like us could get our hands on it and potentially misinterpret it. So, and that's understandable. I mean, for so much of the history of spirituality, that's been the case, and for good reasons, because sometimes there were terrible consequences if these teachings were misunderstood. So, for example, many of the Taoists who were talking about achieving immortality were talking about achieving the immortality of consciousness and not of the body, but they were misunderstood by people who wrote fairy tales around the idea of the immortals, these Taoist masters who actually converted their bodies into light and were able to live forever. And there are schools that believe that. And of course, in the Buddhist schools, the idea was, well, why would you do that? I mean, who would want to be in a body forever in this realm? And so all of this conflict, which if you read the history of the materials in China is apparent, I think was amplified when the very first Westerner showed up and said, I'm really interested in this. And the first thing that he did, he does the golden flower and he does the I Ching. And these are the two greatly sacred texts to China that the oracle itself is so powerful. And as we discussed in another of our discussions, my experience with it, and I'm sure many of your listeners too, the I Ching is an incredible tool. It's when you respect it and you use it the right way, it's like having the sage with you. And I've gotten out of so many terrible jams that I got myself into, and the I Ching has given me these very detailed responses about do this, now don't, now do that, and then to get me out of them. And I look back in retrospect and think, wow, I mean, it's even beyond when I used to be able to go talk to Manly Hall about getting out of situations that I got myself into. And he was very helpful with his life experience. So definitely, I feel that I don't believe that Wilhelm achieved the entire liberation of the golden flower, because his translation shows that he misunderstood some of the most important elements of it. But he achieved enough of it to have a great liberating influence on other people, including Jung.
Well, Ronnie, this has been a wonderful intellectual, spiritual excursion. And I have to say, I think the best part of it was our discussion of the amazing transformation that you went through from being a petty criminal and somebody associated with violence to becoming a scholar of the esoteric.
Well, thank you. I do think that if I could do it, anybody can. And I'd like to leave you with this one more really short little practice that I think goes very nicely with this and is related perhaps to it, which is Ramana Maharshi, who had this not this practice. And that is essentially what you do is you keep asking yourself this question. So, the body, for example. The body has a will of its own. It often scares us. Many of us have that weird experience where we notice something and we say, wait a minute, do I have one of these over here? We're not very well seated in our bodies. For spending so much time in them, we don't seem to know them very well. They're a mystery to us. And to find out what's wrong, we have to go to a psychic or a doctor, or we don't know what this thing's doing sometimes. And so you observe this and you say, well, I have a body, but I'm not my body. Whatever I am is something different than my body. Then you look to your emotions and you say, I have emotions, but I'm not my emotions. My emotions change. I might love somebody today and hate them tomorrow. I may be a violent nihilist when I'm 19, but I may be somebody who's studying under Manly Hall when I'm 21. And it changes. The emotions change so much that I can't find self in that. And what about my thoughts? Well, it's the same thing. Our philosophies change. What we think about things changes. I was somebody that was deeply cynical and thought that I knew everything. I had a terrific case of false certainty. And now I'm happy to say that I don't know that much. I can share a lot, but I'm happy to not know. I'm happy to meet the mystery of life with a sense of faith, even though life can be terrible. And I see a lot of things happening around that are terrible to witness, but yet I still believe. And so my thoughts have changed and are changeable. So we go through all the elements that we can find that make up our lives, our possessions, our relationships. We have these things, but we are not these things. And Ramana Maharshi said, what's left when you've done that? When you've questioned every single element of yourself and found out that you have it, but you are not it. And what's left is the consciousness, the shining mind, the pure light of consciousness that brings existence and coherence to the rest of what we normally consider ourselves. And that's a helpful practice, I think, to do alongside the golden flower. And I would leave it with this, which is, so what's it like when you achieve it? And there's this wonderful, the Chinese explanation of it, I think, is beautiful, which is one of the texts says that when you achieve the golden flower, your heart and your bones are as calm as in deep sleep. Your vitality and your energy are like that of married lovers enjoying mutual bliss. And the relationship between the higher and the lower is like that of mother and child cherishing love for each other.
That is beautiful. Well, Ronnie Pontiac, once again, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, sharing your history, sharing your heart and your wisdom with me and with the New Thinking Aloud audience. It's truly been a joy.
Well, thank you so much. It's always a great pleasure to speak with you.
And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us, because you are actually the reason why we are here. I imagine that by now, many of you already realize that in conjunction with White Crow Books, we've just launched the New Thinking Aloud Dialogues book imprint, and our first title is There Life After Death? New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.